Speaking of growth stocks, the $1 trillion club adding a new name to its friend list. Facebook closing above $1 trillion in market cap for the first time yesterday, joining Microsoft, Amazon, and Alphabet, all with that 12-figure valuation. But can the market keep sustaining these valuations for much longer? Joining us now is Greg Branch. He's managing director at Veritas Financial Group. Greg, what do you think? Is it time to double down on big tech?
Yeah, look, I think all the factors are working in big tech's favor right now. Look, there were three headwinds that we were looking at 6 weeks ago, right? The first is, what was the interest rate environment going to be? Because as we know, a rising rate environment is significantly more harmful for tech and growth. The second was, what is the true earnings power of these companies? What was COVID-related bump versus what is the long-term secular growth story for these companies? And I think we're in the midst of proving that. I think as we continue to see record earnings, I think as we continue to see record growth rates, we saw digital advertising come in with 30% plus compound annual growth. We saw cloud come in, many of those companies at 50%. So we're in the midst of proving that the experience we had with them last year was not just COVID related, but they were in the midst of some secular stories that are worth paying attention to.
Greg, you talk about all those business factors that are at foot here, right? And sort of what the earnings are going to be and what the pandemic did for these tech stocks. But what about the Washington factor? I'm a Washington guy, and I always look at the overhang of regulation and sort of the populist anger at some of these companies that we're seeing in Washington. How do you factor that in as an analyst looking at how these companies might perform?
Yeah, I don't think that headwind has been resolved. I look at that as more postponed, because you're exactly right. I think the public furor has contributed to what we'll see is a second round and maybe a third round of the states coming back and the FTC coming back. But the judicial branch has put a line in the sand that anecdotal evidence, that diatribes from elected officials are not enough to try and establish monopoly power or anti-competitive behavior, which is really difficult to establish when we're talking about services that are free to consumers in many cases. And so I think big tech breathed a sigh of relief yesterday. I think the investors breathed a sigh of relief, and I think we've postponed resolution of this headwind into further months.
Greg, what about Lina Khan at the FTC, and is this somebody who can change the rules of the game that are currently being applied?
Not if the judiciary doesn't cooperate in a unified way. But again, I think we need to examine what is the nature of anti-competitive and what will get the judicial branch to agree that something is anti-competitive, particularly where we're not charging consumers. And so as long as we're staving off the answer to that, we're going to focus on the fundamentals of these companies, which are resoundingly good. There are secular growth stories here that are underappreciated and not in the valuation of the stocks, whether that's the phone business at Zoom, whether that's e-commerce at Facebook and their take rates and their license fees, which are not properly counted in, I think, whether it's the cloud businesses. There are strong secular growth stories here.
Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the broadcast, but I wonder about Zoom fatigue, right? As everything is opening up again and people are going back to work, I think you worry about sort of screen fatigue overall. There's only so much time you can spend looking at your laptop and your phone and all your devices and talking to Alexa at home, working in your living room, as so many white-collar workers have been. Where is the edge of the cliff in terms of Zoom fatigue and screen fatigue overall as people get back into their real life and they go to the beach and they do things on July 4th and all that stuff that we've been waiting so long to actually be able to do?
Right. This is a pertinent argument when we talk about the digital advertising cycle as well. There is no doubt that we saw a pandemic-induced engagement bump last year. But what we're finding is that although user growth is plateauing, engagement is actually remaining persistent. So while I do think that the pendulum will swing back a bit, what we're finding is that people have incorporated this into their new daily lives, that the engagement that they are incorporating into everyday tasks like shopping or checking things online, that may persist. And so we haven't seen the actual engagement plateau in ways that I think consensus was expecting.
I like that, our new daily lives, sort of the new normal. Thanks very much, Greg Branch, for that. And now we've got that new